Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to talk here this afternoon. There's a difference between talking about how learning environment can be used and actually using one, and I know this because that's what I faced when I left the OECD back in 2016 and joined a university in London to run a postgraduate program, teaching program in a school of architecture. Nevertheless, the conversations that we have both about teaching practice and indeed about the spaces that support teaching are probably very similar to those that are had for all levels of education. So what I'm going to talk about today is that the spaces that we use are reflecting some of the changes that we're seeing in learning and teaching. And in a way this is a bit of a narrative, because what I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about why this is and why it might be important to us, and then how we can take advantage of it in our sort of teaching practice. So I came up with this, I found this cartoon, which is a prediction of a learning environment in the year 2000. It was a prediction that was drawn in 1910. There are some things that might be, I suppose, familiar. They've got the desks lined up in a row. Yet, of course, there is one difference, and that's the technology. The students are directly connected to the knowledge, to the books that are being actually put into this device here, and the knowledge is coming out of into their earphones. Some people might think that's remarkably similar to what's happening today. So how accurate was the prediction? Well, we'll come back to that one. What I want to do, first of all, is to talk a little bit about how the development of skills and what we're actually preparing students for in education is changing. And we've heard a little bit about that already today. And it looks here as if Pepper, and I don't think Julia's here now, but as if Pepper has now got some ambition. Societies rely on education, or students or young people being educated in democracy, for health, well-being of societies. One point to make, I suppose, is that the once common routine manual skills, industrial skills and so on, that one would have found in factories, have now been automated, or are continuing to be automated, as indeed are clerical skills. And so the demands there are demands being placed on students coming out of schools, and indeed I think universities, with much broader sets of skills. And an interesting survey that was done fairly recently of chief executives of global organizations, international organizations, suggests that the kind of common types of skills that they're looking for, the key kind of skills, are problem solving, adaptability, collaboration, leadership, creativity, emotional intelligence, some of these things that we've heard about again today, in addition to their core technical skills. But of course these are skills that can't be taught as such. have to be, I think, learned. So to meet the demands of 21st century learning, education systems are expected to help students develop ways of thinking, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, and so on. Ways of working, collaboration, teamwork, and ways of living together, empathy, self-esteem, resilience. And of course, technology is having a significant impact on this. As we know, technology is enabling us all to learn, access information, and therefore learn and collaborate anywhere at any time. So it's acting as a significant, I think, a significant driver. So teaching is the pedagogy is shifting its focus from teaching to learning. So once teachers perhaps were seen more as the expert, whereas now they're the facilitator of learning. And students were seen as passive, but now are more active. And space, therefore, is changing. The space that supports that teaching and learning is changing to help suit that. And just to continue the story very briefly and very quickly, the innovation in approaches to teaching, of course, is leading to things like regrouping of teachers, and this came from some research that we did at the OECD. So there's much more focus now on team teaching, collaboration, and then we're seeing regrouping of learners. So learners, different ages perhaps, in the same groups, larger groups, smaller groups, and so therefore a variety of group sizes. And of course, rescheduling of learning, so learning perhaps not quite programmed and timetabled in the same way that it used to be. And innovation in widening pedagogical types, more pedagogies, different pedagogies, and perhaps problem-based learning, project-based learning. We've heard, again, a little bit about some of those things today. So how might that translate into space? Well, here is a diagram that says a little bit, or suggests a little bit about how this might happen with particular kinds of pedagogy. Here on the left, perhaps collaboration, to how the spaces might, on the right, support these different kinds of pedagogy. So you might have spaces that have diverse settings for allow students to work together, allow them to work individually, spaces that are quiet, that allow them to concentrate, and so on. And it translates into, of course, a diverse range of settings. And I refer, these are kind of learning settings, if you like, rather than necessarily the building itself, the school building itself. And of course, there are many more types of settings we could look at than I've put up here. And perhaps some of those will come out in some of the later slides. But of course, You know, we've got these sort of different types of group discussion settings. And as Olaf was saying, actually, and I think I would agree with him from my experience too, and talking to others, that there's nothing wrong with the presentation type format, because there's a reason one might do lectures, as he said. But it's just one of a mix, one of a variety of different ways that we can engage students in the teaching and in learning. And so part of it is identifying how we might want to facilitate the particular learning of the particular project, the particular exercise we want to do, and therefore what the setting might be for that. So it could be smaller groups, it could be students working individually. Therefore, learning environments are being designed to encourage social interaction, and I'm sure we can all agree that learning is a social process. They're learner-centered, and they're being designed to enable collaboration. And this, in terms of the way we're seeing buildings, schools as buildings being designed, we're seeing a lot more focus on creating interconnectivity, physical connection between spaces. And of course this is paralleled with the technical connection provided by Wi-Fi and technical devices that enables much more collaboration. Flexibility, a word I tend to use with some caution, but here I will just say it's to accommodate change, enables change in some way or shape or form to happen, because we want to change the environments that we use. So the building, the space, the physical infrastructure has to somehow support how we might want to change it, whether it's moving the furniture about or sometimes opening up a wall to create a larger space from two smaller spaces. And transparency, which puts education on display. And there's been a lot of interest in the notion now that rather than hide learning and indeed teaching in separate rooms behind solid walls, is to open it out and enable everybody to see what's happening, experience the learning in the building, in the school or in the university even. But also this raises, of course, some questions for us as teachers about putting us on show. We're now actually visible. We can be seen, what we do. So how we cope with that, how we learn perhaps not to be so worried about people watching what we do. And of course here you can see some of the examples of some of the other points I was talking about and raising just now about interconnectivity and flexibility. This, you may remember from Vega's presentation earlier, is one of the Global School Alliance. It's the Senior Albany High School in New Zealand. And it sort of perhaps bears some resemblance to the interior of the school that he was showing. Here's another school down, not in Australia, same hemisphere, 3 hours flight away. So it's quite a long way away actually from New Zealand, although we in the northern hemisphere tend to think of everything down there being sort of next door to each other. Again, some very similar ideas and themes coming out of this school, particularly flexibility. And one of the points I wanted to make here, looking at this particular school interior, was that the key to flexibility in Northern Beaches Christian High School is the ability to be able to move and reconfigure the furniture in particular, and do it quickly and easily. So if we look at this slide, this picture on the bottom left of the screen, you'll see that actually all these desks and chairs have these little wheels on, casters. Very easy for the kids to move the furniture about to suit different needs. And it's a science lesson that's happening here. And indeed, there's a similar, although we can't see them moving around the furniture in the bottom right picture there, but there's a similar idea there. They can just rearrange all of that very quickly, and they get the children, they get the students to do it. It's not done before the class starts. So we might be able to use these sorts of spaces by thinking about how quickly we can rearrange the furniture into different arrangements. And indeed, on the top right, there's a much more conventional classroom, or at least for this school, it's more conventional, where everybody is focused on a screen. And of course, there is a role for that kind of approach as well in these learning environments. Technology. I'm going to, oops, no. One of these situations, I wasn't allowed to show pictures with students in them, so I had to clear the students out. It's a shame, really, because buildings need people. But basically, this particular school in Copenhagen has a high degree of interconnectivity between the different spaces. And indeed, in the central atrium, the main entrance hall, they have this, what looks like a grand stair, the sort of thing that came in design idea from, of course, the grand palaces that you see here in Italy, and that we then borrowed as a design idea in Britain in the 1600s. But of course, these are both serve as a part of the circulation route, but also as an auditorium where students can gather at the morning assembly. And I would just remind you that although I'm showing pictures mainly of interiors, the exterior and the bottom right there is another grand stair that goes down outside to part of a harbour, is equally important. And the outside spaces, and I think often we don't use them enough, perhaps, and it may depend on the weather, and certainly can do in the UK. Another school which is interesting because, again, it's actually designed as a large open space. But what they've done is divide off parts of this space with these sort of small partitions where actually they indicate the different kinds of activities that could happen. What the designers called spaces for creating purposeful spaces. And inevitably, one of the difficulties in these large open environments is how one deals with sound, acoustics. Because, of course, how can you have two teachers working with adjacent groups of students, one doing a noisy activity, one doing a very quiet activity? You can't, in reality. You have to have some collaboration between the teachers about what kinds of activities are going on. And indeed, in those sort of open plan schools designed in the 70s and 80s, and 60s, 70s and 80s, which there were a lot, acoustics was a significant problem with them. That alongside perhaps the fact that maybe teaching wasn't itself in quite the same place, if you like, that the architecture was. Here's a small primary school, or it's an academy in London. Again, a similar kind of idea. Groups of students working around this space, much more division. But actually, there are no real doors here. There are well-defined areas where different activities are taking place and different things are going on, as you can see. But no real doors where you can actually just lock off a part of a school building. So one of the issues that I think comes up, particularly, as I say, when one's talking about team teaching, collaborative teaching, is, and what they do here is actually they have 2 or 3 teachers with much larger groups of students working in a series of these spaces. And what they found is that different teachers have different relationships with different students, partly because some are more able to deal with particular student needs than other teachers. And so whilst teaching huge groups might seem a very difficult thing to do, they've certainly worked out a way of doing that and making it effective. And it goes back to how one looks at trying to perhaps meet this idea of personalization, teaching, learning, student individualization, personalization. And the environment here too in this illustration is also, not only is it showing this interconnectivity and transparency, but is also putting learning on display in other ways too. And so it's all around you. And it's an attempt also to use the building as part of that, as part of being the third teacher, this idea that the building and the environment itself can be used as a means for learning, where you might measure things, you might measure how much energy is being used, how much light there is, how much space there is. Not itself a new idea. And I think one of the things I've found, and that's really interesting for me, I think, is that some of these ideas that we talk about in what we're calling 21st century learning environments, but maybe we perhaps should drop the 21st century term now, what are often actually not new. I've got a whole slide set that shows very similar environments going back over 1,000 years with images, albeit not photographs, because those are only a fairly recent invention. But nevertheless, some of these learning environments, these settings, if you like, are really not new. And perhaps we got funneled down this sort of more industrialized model of teaching and learning back in the 1800s as mass education developed, and the need to educate all students for basic numeracy and literacy to meet the growing economies around the world through the Industrial Revolution. Here's a view of the future. Actually, this is a view of the future done about 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. But the idea here is that you can write on all the surfaces, well, not the ceiling at the moment, but the tabletops, the floors, the walls, the glass screens. You have interconnectivity, you have screens that, and technology that allows you to connect with other schools around the country, around the world. So students don't even have to be in the classroom anymore. They could be somewhere else. And of course, this poses all sorts of questions for us as teachers and users of teaching, of these sort of spaces, about how we might do that. I couldn't help put this one in because it sort of connects back a bit to using the school as the teacher, as the building as the teacher. This is a concept school that was done for the, actually placed on the River Thames. And using the idea, two ideas. One is the significant tidal difference between high tide and low tide on the River Thames to generate energy, which itself can actually be used as a teaching and learning tool as well as something more productive. But also the idea that you can actually bring the education right out into the river itself. You've got science laboratories here, and you can actually overlook the river there and reach right out into it. This notion that it connects, perhaps, the school very much to the context and to the environment. And just before I sort of draw this to a close, I found this design by Danish Karani in the US a really interesting example of perhaps taking some of these different notions that are talked about and creating a school environment which is sort of varied and varied settings, as you can see. It's open, it's connected. They use a lot of technology in here, of course, as well. And the sort of school as a laboratory idea, not that they're experimenting on the students, on the kids, but they're getting the kids to do the experiments as if the school itself was a laboratory. I think that's very interesting, and of course you'll see that furniture can be easily moved around, and actually they can recreate or create new kind of learning settings depending on what the focus of the teaching is, as well as scribbling on the walls and indeed on the glass screens, although they haven't there. So back to our prediction of the future. Well, this is as close as I could get in terms of images that I could find. We've just seen the prediction of the class in 2000. Well, actually, this comes from Georgetown School of Law, actually, but in the year 2005. Some similarities. You know, you've got, okay, they're not actually wired in, although I desperately looked for one, but there's not one connected with headphones. They're all being very good. I love the idea that the blackboard is still there. I think that's really, really interesting, and why not? So that prediction had it nearly right. But then again, you know, one could say, well, what changes? So we have learning anywhere, anytime now, facilitated by technology. The ancient Greeks had learning anywhere, anytime, facilitated by slightly different technology. Nevertheless, it was the technology of the time that supported it. So with that, I would just like to sort of say that from what I've learned in moving into the sort of teaching arena, albeit in higher education rather than schools, about how we use learning spaces, as I think taught me to find ways of actually trying things out and seeing what works best for the particular kinds of situations that I've got. But it does need the environment, the physical environment, to be able to support that. So, thank you very much.